can see me now, and thank you for the introduction. Of course, I'm aware of very many issues which affect admissions. Are A-levels, as an example, appropriate, or other qualifications that we currently use appropriate as entry criteria? Should we be anonymizing the entry system, both in terms of individuals' names, but also in terms of the schools that they come from? Should we continue to offer conditional, unconditional offers? There are a range of issues which, of course, we could discuss. I want, though, to focus on two. One relates to post-qualification admissions and the other to contextualization. If I can start with PQA, of course, we currently have a system where more than 90% of all undergraduates coming to UK universities are accepted on the basis of predicted grades. And I think it's self-evident to everyone that actual grades would be more accurate than predicted grades. However, that's not the whole story, because of course teachers are really rather good at predicting grades. They simply very often, in fact almost always, over-predict. But of course universities are quite good at correcting for that over-prediction. So to some extent the system of acceptances on the basis of predictions works reasonably well. And for this particular meeting, it's interesting to note that it doesn't seem to disadvantage students any more than utilising actual grades would. Data HE have looked at this in some detail, and if anything, it actually slightly advantages disadvantaged students. The other advantage of using predicted grades, of course, is that it gives a longer period of time for students to engage with universities and perhaps develop a relationship with them. However, I think on balance, because it doesn't, to my mind, fit comfortably with what you might call legitimate expectations of students, both in terms of the transparency of the process and the validity of the recruitment activity, that I think utilising actual grades would be more appropriate. However, of course, that presents operational problems. If we were to start the whole process following the results day, it would be difficult to fit it all in between then and the current arrivals day of students. And it's been suggested that we should move the university academic year to a January start date, but I believe that would be a disaster. I think we'd have 18-year-olds sitting in what I would call idle despondency for about 6 months. We could, of course, introduce a system. I think it happens in some Scandinavian countries where you have something akin to a national service for a period of time, but I don't think there's any particular enthusiasm for that to happen from the UK government. There is, though, the opportunity, I think, now for the introduction of a post-qualifications offer system. So applications would be made in the current cycle. This would allow a period of time when DBS checks, interviews, etc. could be carried out. Offers would be made on the basis of the actual, not predicted grades, and they'd be made at or very soon after results day. Applicants would choose which of those offers they wished to accept. And then there would be a clearing process after that, very much as the one that we currently have for those who get poorer results than they expected, or indeed for those who get better results and would wish to trade up. Of course, this system would need very good advice and information in that latter part of the summer during that process, but the students should have been getting this anyway throughout the year. And indeed, those students who currently go through the clearing process require that information. So that would be something we should enhance anyway. So I believe we should move to a post-qualification offer system, but that won't, in my mind, actually do much in terms of fair admission. And I think the critical issue with regard to fair admission is whether we could contextualize the offers in a much more robust way. It's, of course, perfectly legitimate to be impartial at the time of recruitment, but that doesn't mean it's actually fair, particularly to individuals who have a legacy of educational disadvantage. We know that students from state schools with the same entrance qualifications, so the same qualifications at the time of admission as those from independent schools, do better. It's about 6.5%. And indeed, the gap increases depending on how much has been spent at the independent school. So there's good evidence to suggest that we should contextualize, but how should we do that, and how should we do it in a fair and standardized way? We could use, of course, free school meals as a measure, but I think the index of multiple deprivation is perhaps a more appropriate measure. Now, the index of multiple deprivation is a universally government-derived index. It's based on individuals' location in terms of the average income, health, employment, education, housing, crime, and environment characteristics of their area. And it ranks populations of about 1,500, so it's quite granular across the country. So the area which is ranked 1 would be the most deprived, and it goes right up to about 30,000, which is the least deprived. And of course, utilizing the index of multiple deprivation, you could offer those in the lowest decile or the lowest several deciles, either an enhanced tariff, or each university, as they do in Scotland, could create minimum tariffs for particular courses, and any students who fit into those lower deciles would automatically be accepted onto those courses without the necessity of going through the competitive process. So I think actually there is an opportunity to undertake a much more robust contextualization across all universities in the UK, and I think that that would greatly support those from disadvantaged backgrounds getting into universities. I don't think it's rocket science, and I think it could be introduced very quickly. So that concludes my opening comments, Adam. So please, can I transfer back to you, and thank you for the time to give that introduction.
Thanks ever so much for that, Quintin. We're still having a little bit of trouble getting Minto on. Some really interesting comments there. I'm sure a lot of discussion to be had once we've heard from the other speakers, and I already see that there's some questions in the Q&A sections. Obviously, we'll have more opportunities to reflect on what you've just presented. We'll also now hand over to our second speaker of the day, Mary Kernock-Cook, an independent education consultant, very well known in the sector. Mary, perhaps if you could briefly introduce yourself and then get started with your opening remarks, and hopefully Minto will have emerged by the end of your segment. Thank you very much for that.
Well, good morning, everybody, and thanks, Adam. And I'm not quite sure how to introduce myself, but perhaps saying that I'm currently chairing the Student Futures Commission, supported by the UPP Foundation, is a good start. And probably many people on the call will recognise me as a former chief exec of UCAS. I can hardly believe it's nearly 5 years since I left, so that's probably not quite so relevant anymore. But thanks very much for including me on this panel. When Omar first invited me to contribute, I think the immediate challenge for tackling fair admissions in the UK was probably slightly different. It feels to me that in the past few weeks, even in the past few days, the ground has shifted quite a bit. Now, for some time, quite some time, the fair access conversation has been broadly around how to get more people from, excuse me, lower income backgrounds into university, and particularly higher tariff universities where the biggest gaps in access are. The gaps are biggest for people with lower income backgrounds because the more disadvantage is highly correlated with poorer education outcomes. That is a lower likelihood of progressing to level 3 in education at all, and where there is progression to level 3, getting lower grades in A levels, and or being more likely to have chosen BTECs or other applied general qualifications, which of course have got slightly lower progression currency for higher education, particularly for higher tariff courses. This is a massive simplification of who's disadvantaged in progression to HE, and there are lots of nuances, as Eunice said, around, for example, men and women, ethnic minorities, North and South, London versus the rest of the UK, age, disability, and so on. So the question for fair admissions, the topic of this conference, has been about ways in which the current admission system might exacerbate the disadvantages of some groups of applicants. And for many years, this has centered around the villain of the piece, namely predicted grades, and of course, the concept of post-qualification applications, or more recently, what I think of as sort of PQA light, or post-qualification offers, PQO, as Quentin mentioned earlier. Today, I want to suggest that the context for this conversation has changed quite radically since UUK and Quentin's group published their findings in November 2020, I think it was, and since the DFE published their consultation a year or so ago. Firstly, the whole education system, including university admissions, is reeling from the impacts of the pandemic and 2 years of cancelled exams. This means that colleagues across schools, colleges, and universities, I think, will really struggle confidently to navigate the current system, let alone a changed one, because they can no longer rely on decades of experience and data to make reasonable assumptions about who will and won't get into university and be able to succeed when they get there. Supply of places in higher education and demand for them from potential students is in flux too, because of the unusual admissions intakes in 2020 and 21, particularly artificially inflating the number of successful admissions. Many higher tariff universities in particular are bursting at the seams after 2 years of having to accommodate applicants with highly inflated grades. And meanwhile, the job market is looking buoyant again, and that usually signals a dip in demand for higher education. So in short, the very finely balanced ecosystem of higher education admissions has been quite seriously unbalanced. And this summer will be another unpredictable year, because although we widely expect and hope that exams will go ahead, no one is quite sure how the grade boundaries will be set, and therefore how many students are likely to be qualified and at what level. Now, the impacts of disrupted schooling are going to probably filter on through for several more admission cycles, probably until, I reckon, at least 2027, given the potential impact of inflated GCSE grades, lost learning right through the years, changes in the job market, the rising cost of living, and so on. So I think my first point is that given changes to the admission system carry quite significant risk of unintended consequences, anything in the next 5 years is probably too soon. And it will also be very difficult to monitor and evaluate the consequences of any big change, because the underlying data is so unstable. Leaving aside the turbulence caused by the pandemic, I remain convinced that the predicted grade conditional offer system is actually helping more applicants from disadvantaged backgrounds than it's hindering. We often say, don't we, that we want to admit students on their potential and not just on grades, and then we seem to be advocating for throwing out the only and the well-established and well-understood mechanism for signaling potential, namely predicted grades. And as Quentin mentioned, I do urge you to read Mark Corver's essay in the HEPI collection on all of this for more about how many students from low income, ethnic minority backgrounds, male students and so on, are in fact helped by the opportunity for their teachers to forecast their potential through predicted grades. I sometimes think I might be guilty of blindly defending my old mothership UCAS, but believe me, I've probably pored over more analysis and given more hours of thought about how to make the current system fairer than a lot of people. And I do keep coming back to the conclusion that the UCAS system works pretty well, and that over 5, nearly 6 decades now, it has successfully weathered enormous growth in HE over the decades, and indeed has performed well in periods of different balance of supply and demand. It's performed well in number controlled and in uncapped systems. It's performed across different systems in England, Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland, and including over those weird few years when we had number caps attached to grades in 2012 to 2015. That said, there are a couple of things that I feel should be on the table for short-term implementation in view of the current turbulence. The likely growth in demand over the next 10 years or so, and also where I think the government and the regulator have signalled what looks to me like quite a massive disincentive for contextual offers as the principal lever for widening participation, as it has been in recent years. So here's my short list to discuss. Firstly, a gathered field, meaning that no offers are made until the January application deadline has passed. That's today, by the way. And I think that would enable universities to prioritise offers to disadvantaged groups who we know tend to apply later in the cycle. Secondly, I think it's very easy in the UCAS system to identify the students who overachieve on their predicted grades. And I think they should all be getting a message, probably through the UCAS system, as soon as those results are in, outlining the options that might be different for them, given that they've overachieved. Thirdly, adjustment, which was the great outcome from the Schwartz review back in 2004, I think it was. It's been very underused and it probably seems complicated. I think students tend to use clearing and self-release instead. I think relaunching adjustment to make the process simpler and really improve the information to teachers and advisors about how to use it would be a step in the right direction. And then you could consider opening, if you like, an exclusive adjustment window after results are published and before general clearing opens. And my final point is that actually supporting teachers to reduce the underprediction of grades wouldn't go amiss either, and might be much easier than changing the whole admission system. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mary, and good morning, everyone. It's great to be here with you all. My sincere apologies for the delay and the technical issues. It wouldn't be a webinar without at least one Zoom hiccup. So I do apologize, and it's great to be in this discussion. I was actually watching the entire discussion throughout, just couldn't participate. And so thank you again to Mary and to Quintin. And hello to Vicky Bolivar, who will be our next speaker. Vicky, again, a very well-known face in the sector, is a professor in the Department of Sociology at Durham University, and her research focuses on the social inequalities of access to the most prestigious universities. I think anyone that has worked, researched, read about this topic and would of course, you can't engage with this issue without coming across Vicky's work. So Vicky, thank you, and over to you. And I can see that there's a little fairy actor who wants to get involved as well, which is great.
Yes, the cat will make an appearance, I'm sure, at various intervals. So I'm just going to share my screen, if I may. Hopefully you can see that. Just one second, if I can figure out how to make this bigger. Does anybody know what keys you press to make the slides turn into a slideshow?
If you go to slideshow, Vicky, you should be able to say present, or there's the little button down in the corner that's like, I don't really know how to describe it, but next to the sort of book button. I think the one to the right of that, I think, should make it bigger.
Ah, there we go. Yes, thank you. It's just that the Zoom menu is covering my toolbar. Yeah, thank you so much for the opportunity to speak today. As Minto said, my research focuses on access to the higher tariff universities in particular, and I've been a big advocate of the use of contextual offer making to widen participation. And so I want to say a few things about those things as key elements of wider and fairer access going forward. And I just wanted to start by pointing to what I think is a really positive development within the sector, and in particular amongst high tariff universities, which is that under the stewardship under Chris Millward's stewardship of the Office for Students, we have seen higher tariff universities take on much more responsibility than ever before for making real progress on widening access to the most selective institutions. And I think this is a really important development because we've had a long period of virtually no equalisation in rates of entry for different socioeconomic groups in respect of higher tariff universities. And there's long been a pushing aside of the responsibility for that to the school sector and wider social inequalities. But it's really great to see that higher tariff universities in their access and participation plans have accepted that they have a big role to play in changing the current socioeconomic mix of the students that enter these higher tariff institutions. So I'm showing you here a comparison for the top third most selective universities in England of the polar quintile 5 to quintile 1 ratio of entrants in around 2017. The baseline is the red bars there, and you'll see really starkly large polar ratios for entrants in that baseline year. And the green bars show the ratio targets that these institutions have committed to achieving by 2024, 2025. And in every case, you can see that there is a real step change in the ambition here to widen access to these institutions. And as we know, the past few years, the impact of the pandemic has disrupted the progress towards an equalisation of this ratio. We've seen more students from disadvantaged backgrounds admitted to these universities, but because it's also been the case that we've had more admissions of more advantaged students, this ratio hasn't equalised yet. But it's really important that these targets are in place and that they remain in place, and that this part of the sector has embraced the challenge set out for them by the Office for Students. And I think it's really important to also recognise and continue to remember that those targets are not going to be achievable unless contextualised admissions is practised in an increasingly ambitious and bold way as we go forward. So I'm showing you here some recently published results from an analysis of national pupil database data. So this covers all school pupils in England at both state and private schools. And I'm showing you here the relationship between whether a young person was ever eligible for free school meals whilst they were at secondary school, and the cumulative distribution of attainment for free school meals versus non-free school meals young people by the age of 18, 19. This data includes people who didn't actually progress on to Key Stage 5 or did but didn't ultimately achieve any qualification. So it includes those who drop out of the education system before they get to that point of potentially being eligible for university. And what's really important for us to always remember is that the very high grades that high tariff universities often stipulate in their standard entry requirements are a huge stretch for those from disadvantaged backgrounds. So if we look at the top 10% of performers who are non-free school meals young people, their performance is equivalent to 3 A's or better at A level. So non-free school meal people, the top 10% of performers in that category will pretty easily be eligible for admission on standard entry requirements to high tariff universities. But if we look specifically at those who were in receipt of free school meals and we ask who are the top 10% of performers by age 18 in that category, we see that the grade threshold for being in the top 10% of free school meal performers is much lower at BCC. So there's a big gap in attainment, and we really need to recognise that for disadvantaged young people, what might look like a somewhat mediocre performance within the national distribution is actually a really stellar achievement given the socioeconomic circumstances in which those young people live and are educated. And so it's really important that we that we continue and we step up our efforts to contextualise people's grades and to reduce academic entry requirements for disadvantaged young people. Obviously, we need to support young people once they get to university, and the access and participation plans for high tariff universities also show a sort of pretty new commitment to taking responsibility for the existing attainment gaps between disadvantaged and non-disadvantaged students, and a whole raft of new initiatives designed to better support young people who have high potential but perhaps need additional support to fill in gaps in knowledge, gaps in study and academic skills. And so I think the combination of contextualized admissions and real genuine support for students once at university carries a lot of promise to achieve wider and fairer access. Now, I just want to say one more thing, and that's about how we go about identifying disadvantaged individuals, how we go about deciding who is eligible for a contextual offer. And if you've heard me speak before, you'll have heard me say this many times, that the current use of POLAR to set widening access targets and to identify recipients of contextual offers is really problematic. And that's because it doesn't really do a very good job of capturing the genuinely disadvantaged. And I would add, in response to what Quintin said earlier, that other area-based measures, such as the index of multiple deprivation, are similarly flawed. They're not as bad as POLAR, but they are still quite bad at capturing individual level disadvantage. And I try to illustrate this here in a paper that was recently published in the British Journal of Sociology. And what this is showing you is how the POLAR measure and the IMD measure, to what extent it overlaps with a category of young people who we know to definitely be disadvantaged. And that's those who were ever in receipt of free school meals while they were at secondary school. So the free school meals young people in the English school population is represented by the circle with the solid line in each of these Venn diagrams. And what we see is that both POLAR and IMD, that are represented with the dotted lines, do quite a poor job of capturing free school meal young people. In fact, using POLAR or using IMD will mean that more than half of free school meal young people are not identified as disadvantaged, even though we know that they are. So I've labelled these here as false negatives using the POLAR or the IMD measure. And on the flip side, many of those, more than half of those who are identified as being in a POLAR quintile 1 area or an IMD quintile 1 area are not free school meal recipients. Some of them will be genuinely disadvantaged from low income families and so on, but I suggest that a significant proportion of those are likely to be false positives, people who are actually not disadvantaged at the individual and household level, but just happen to live in these particular areas. So one point that I really want to underscore is that if contextualized admissions is really going to do the job that we'd like to see it do, then we absolutely must use individual level measures to determine who's eligible for contextual offers. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Vicky, and we'll come back to many of those themes shortly. And I did realise in the excitement of being able to join the call, I didn't introduce myself properly either. My name is Minto and I'm from Nous Group. We work with communities and governments and organisations to have a positive influence, and in the UK have a particular interest in the higher education sector. We've worked with a range of universities and other organisations on these issues and other matters pertaining to equality, diversity and inclusion. But that's plenty about me, and we'll get cracking with questions. There's been a great flurry of questions that have come through. Mary, we might start with you if that's okay. We've got a question that's come through around the work that you referenced when you were at UCAS. Did that work on predicted grades? Was it effective in predicting potential in terms of completion rates and degree outcomes? And are they better than examination results? So we've had that come through from the floor.
Yeah, that's a really great question, and actually, Vicky might know better than me whether that specific research has been done. So I don't know the precise answer about how correlated predicted grades are with outcomes, but I do know that outcomes, so continuation rates and attainment rates at university, are divided on very much the same lines as attainment at schools are. So people from more disadvantaged backgrounds are less likely to progress and succeed at university. And you know, in a sense, that's what the whole debate is about. And the recent the consultations last week issued from the Office for Students are underlining that. And you know, I'd be really interested to hear what Vicky and others think. You know, it feels to me as if the regulator and the government are saying, don't do contextual offers anymore, because letting disadvantaged students in who might not be qualified to succeed is a bad idea, and switch the focus to closing the gap in attainment in secondary education. So you know, that's why I think that the sands have shifted quite significantly, particularly with those consultations published, but the mood music has been around for a while now.
Thank you. Vicky, did you want to come in?
Yeah, I share Mary's concern that there may be this shift away from contextualized admissions, the idea that a certain threshold of attainment, regardless of your background, is required to do well in education. And it's notable that in terms of the consultation, equality of access is a second priority, with quality, whatever that may turn out to mean, being first. And so that is a little bit concerning. But I would hope that the Office for Students would continue with its focus on addressing the gaps that Mary's mentioned in completion and achievement that already exist for disadvantaged students who are coming in with the standard entry requirements, who have performed just as well at A level as their more advantaged peers. We're clearly, particularly in the higher tariff universities, not doing enough to support them to stay in their degree programs and do well. And so I hope that the Office for Students will push forward with the support that universities, particularly higher tariff ones who are less developed in this respect, the support that universities are providing on course to make sure that that potential is fulfilled.
Thank you. We might move on. We've had another really interesting questions that have come through. I think we'll straddle the practical to the philosophical, and so we'll go to this question, which is also from an anonymous attendee, which in broad I think speaks to reshaping perhaps the profile of who goes to higher education, not just being able to give those from disadvantaged backgrounds to access to higher education, but should we be encouraging students that have gone to higher tariff universities to other types of institutions, or indeed encourage or persuade students from advantaged backgrounds to consider other pathways in higher education. So I might throw to Quintin to sort of share your musings on this topic as a leader of a higher education institution.
Yeah, thanks very much. I hope we would encourage people from all backgrounds to extend their education in whatever way they choose, and in whatever way is most appropriate to them. So whether it be through apprenticeships, degree apprenticeships, or through a degree program, I absolutely would support that. I think you'd be kind of naive to suggest that those students who get the better grades should be in one way or another persuaded to try and go to lower tariff universities. Now, I'm the leader of a low tariff university and very proud of it, but I think it would be naive of me to expect anyone to try and persuade someone who perhaps had the tariff requirements to get into one of the very high tariff universities to come to my university. I mean, I think it's horses for courses. We do a lot of great things at the University of Hertfordshire in terms of the sort of applied sciences, the applied nature of the work that we do, and the business approach. But I think it's horses for courses, and I really don't think we should be trying to socially manipulate people one way or another.
Did others have any reflections on this question from the panel?
Minto, if I may, you know, I do think that if we could somehow stop what I've sometimes felt is the sort of sleepwalking of, you know, the middle class, more affluent students from, you know, from their A-level sixth forms into high tariff universities with kind of very little thought sometimes as to what they're going to study and why they're going to study it. I do think that would be a good thing, and I really welcome the kind of opening up of different routes. You know, I think this whole encouragement to step from sixth or level 3 to level 4 and then stop for a bit and maybe go on to level 5 and top up later. I'm perhaps a little bit biased because I didn't go to university until I was 40, and you know, I do think sometimes that people who participate in higher education a bit later can have, you know, a much clearer idea of why they're going and therefore what they want to study with what kind of outcomes, and that might, you know, give better success along the way. So I think the opening up of different routes is a good thing. You know, the sort of herd mentality of sixth formers going into 3-year residential degrees, I mean, it's going to be a hard habit to change, but I think chipping away at that broadly is probably a good thing.
Mm. Both your perspectives are really fascinating, and they reflect how ingrained, you know, these attitudes and pathways are in our social fabric. But I think what both of you you know, are saying too is about supporting potential and aspiration in whatever way that is best expressed for that, you know, individual. And sometimes you don't know that when you're 18. Sometimes you don't know that when you're 40. And so, you know, it is about supporting that lifelong pathway, isn't it? Another more very specific question, and Vicky, we might direct this to you, which is what individual level measures can we use to assess disadvantage, and what is practical to use? And that's come through from Sarah Wood.
Well, I understand that UCAS now makes free school meal and a free school meal individual level indicator available at the point of selection. I think it's just for pupils who are educated in England because it's based on the National Pupil Database, but I think that is a really positive development and a good start, and that those applicants are ones that absolutely should be front and center when we're thinking about who to make contextual offers to. Other individual level indicators that could be useful, I think they really need to capture the socioeconomic circumstances of individuals. So they need to be about household income. So free school meals is a very narrow measure. In some ways it captures the most economically deprived young people, and we probably want to broaden that out to include people whose income thresholds were a bit above the threshold for being eligible for free school meals. But that would require some way of making available and validating family income data. Lady Margaret Hall, for their foundation degree, do this. I mean, it's a relatively small program. It's possible for them to ask for additional information about tax returns, etc., and verify this information. A little bit trickier to do it at scale, but there could be ways of looking at family income as another indicator. I think there are some individual level indicators that we need to avoid, however. I think we can't assume that just because somebody's from a state school, they're definitely disadvantaged. Although on the flip side, we might say if they're from a private school, they're definitely not disadvantaged, almost certainly. Same goes, I think, for whether either of your parents have a degree. If they do, probably you are not disadvantaged, but the pool of young people with non-graduate parents is so large that, again, we can't use being first in the family to go to university to guarantee that somebody genuinely is in disadvantaged circumstances. So I think it comes down really to income measures, verifiable income measures that are going to help us really target most precisely who is disadvantaged.
Thank you. Thanks very much. I'm not sure if anybody else wanted to come in on that topic. Quentin.
Yeah, I mean, two things. The first thing is I think the data that Vicky has just shown us is very, very persuasive. I have to say, when we did our review for Universities UK, at that time, free school meal data was not going to be made available. It's really, I think, positive and helpful that it is now being made available. And I think as a group, we all appreciated the value that the free school meal data could give you at an individual level. I wouldn't be too dismissive, though, of the index of multiple deprivation. I think it does capture a lot of issues around individuals' particular circumstance and can be used. But I do appreciate if you look at the data that Vicky has just shown us, that the lack of exact overlap between school meal data and the individual, and look at individual deprivation, that's a better way to do it. But I think you could use both. I think the advantage, of course, of the IMD is it was very universally available and it was quite easy to use, and I think that was per measure.
Thanks very much, Mary.
Yes, just to add to that, I too welcome the provision of free school meal data in the UCAS system. I think that's a great step forward. But don't forget that free school meal is based on an incredibly low income threshold. I think it's something like 15,000 or 16,000. It's really low. And I do sometimes think that in this whole debate, we ignore the sort of quintile 2, whether that's IMD or Polar or any other measure. We ignore the kind of above those very low threshold people who are still living in relative poverty, and probably, and where the very big gaps in access and admissions, and particularly, as Vicky says, to higher tariff universities exist. So I'd quite like us to sort of widen that debate about who is being disadvantaged. It's very, all the data always focuses on quintile 1 in whatever data set is being used. And I think we need to widen that out and recognize that there are lots more people caught up in kind of, whether you want to call it just about managing or struggling or whatever, who suffer various elements of disadvantage in education as a result.
Thanks very much, and I'm really mindful of time. Just to go for another minute or two, just to say that there's been some really interesting debate that's been happening in the chat, and that's also come through in the way of questions, people's different views on the kind of validity and effectiveness of some of these measures, as well as a point that that highlights whether we should be sharing this discussion with school teachers and family members, which I think we would all agree with. Very briefly, to each of the panelists, if I could just go to you, there's one thing that we could change tomorrow to make admissions fairer, more inclusive, to support those from disadvantaged backgrounds to access higher education. In your view, what would that one thing be? And Quintin, we'll start with you. We'll go to Vicky and then close off with Mary, if that's okay.
Well, it would absolutely be a more universal system of contextualization, and whether it's free school meals or whether it's IMD or whether it's a mixture of both, to my mind, would make a huge and positive impact. And I should say, it wouldn't just be to high tariff universities. Remember, it's the other universities that do the heavy lifting as far as widening access is concerned, and getting students into our kind of universities is also hugely important, especially from these less advantaged backgrounds.
Vicky.
Oh, sorry. I'll just, on Quintin's last point, I think the alternative university league tables are really valuable in showing the value added by lower tariff universities around the social mobility of disadvantaged students. And I think one really useful thing would be to incorporate more measures of value added and genuine measures of the quality of the educational and teaching and learning experience in institutions, which would shake up the existing league tables quite considerably if we had more of that and less of how high are the entry requirements, what percentage go on to professional jobs and so on. But I would echo what Quintin said as well about contextualized admissions. I think is really key. And what I'd like to see the sector do is certainly not to row back on contextualized admissions, which I think is a little bit of a risk at the moment with the change in leadership of the Office for Students, but actually to take that forward. I showed some evidence that the attainment gap is really, really large, and just one grade reduction in the standard entry requirement is not going to do very much at all. We need to have quite substantially lower entry requirements for disadvantaged learners, coupled with really robust support systems to help bridge those gaps while at university.
And just before we throw to Mary, I've just had some news that actually we do have a little bit more time for discussion. So my apologies for trying to wrap us up too early. So take your time. We'll take a few more questions for sure. Mary.
Yeah, I mean, I do agree with both Quentin and Vicky about contextual admissions, and I really hope that the changes that we're seeing in the regulations and the thresholds and so on don't sort of stunt the progress that's being made there. Really, the change that would make the most difference would be in key stage 4 attainment. That's where the gaps start opening up, and a lot of the work that universities do tends to get directed towards key stage 5 pupils who have already passed a kind of threshold of attainment at key stage 4 that kind of gets them onto a level 3 program. So I would like to see the efforts moving a bit earlier in the education system, because if we get more people over the key stage 4 threshold of getting a bunch of strong GCSE grades, then I think we'll be able to be much more effective in widening participation and indeed making admissions fairer across the board, because there will be more people applying for university.
Mary, if we could stick with that last point around the schooling system, and you mentioned this in your remarks earlier as well, what further support or guidance could teachers be providing, or indeed could they be empowered with to be able to do this?
Yeah, I mean, this is a difficult one. If I sort of cast my mind back 10 or 15 years, when universities were accused of having unfair admissions, or there being socioeconomic gaps in the data, they would say, well, that's down to schools. If schools can't get people over these thresholds, then that's not our problem. Over my time at UCAS, and more recently, of course, the debate has been much more about universities engaging with ways to make this fair, and particularly through contextual admissions. It feels to me as if, as often happens, the pendulum has kind of swung back again, and that the government and the regulator are saying, well, schools have got to get students up to a threshold that supports successful progression and completion in higher education. But they're also saying that universities should help them do that. And I think that's kind of where the debate is now. Exactly what universities could or should do to remediate poor attainment gaps in secondary education, I'm not quite sure, but I suspect that's what the conversation is going to move to now.
Okay, thank you. We've had a question that's come through earlier, and we've spoken about it in a few different ways, and that's from Johnny Rich, which is, to what extent will the OFS proposals on quality baselines encourage higher education institutions to be less fair in admissions, preferring to admit those students who are more likely to have positive employment outcomes and less likely to drop out? So these are the recent proposals that have been set out by the OFS. Quentin, shall we throw to you to tackle this, and then we might go to the others?
Well, it's a great incentive to do just that, isn't it? And it's a dreadful reflection, really, of what we're trying to achieve in education more broadly. So, I mean, I don't think it. What do I know? Whether it's been done deliberately for that purpose, I doubt that very much. I think the government have a view that success at university depends or is reflected in people being able to, of course, complete their courses, and people graduating successfully and going out and getting great jobs. And I think we all agree with that. But I have absolutely no doubt that the proposals outlined will act as an incentive, because we all know that the likelihood of someone getting a good job is as closely related to how successful their parents have been as it is to their tariff at entry. So this has got to be an incentive to do exactly what has been suggested, and I think it's the wrong, well, it's not necessarily wrong to do that, but you also have to incentivize us in one way or another to contextualize and to bring the people in from disadvantaged backgrounds so that they can achieve just as well. And of course, we then within universities have to look and sharpen our own pencils with regard to the support for those students.
Thank you. Did any of the other panelists want to come in, Mary, Vicky?
Yeah, I'd like to come in, and you know, I do agree with Quentin that I think this is, you know, this is quite critical for the sector. But you know, there is an underlying logic which says, why should the taxpayer fund university courses for people who don't get the benefit from it by moving into successful employment and obviously repaying their loans? And you know, that's not an entirely unreasonable logic. I think my own view is that, you know, we've seen a shift in what students want from higher education. Yes, they want to go and study a course that they're passionate about and interested in, but you know, even if they're studying something that they really love for the love of the academic subject, they also really want it to lead to better career outcomes. And I think there is a case for saying that the sector, although it's done an awful lot about employability and careers support, I think there is a case for saying that the sector just needs to get much better at this, and that they need to be prepared to really embed and make visible the kind of employability. You know, we talk about transferable skills all the time, don't we? But I don't think a lot of students really notice when they're getting transferable skills. They probably need a bit more help to know what they are and who to transfer them to, and indeed how to transfer them.
And we've had a really powerful reflection come through from Johnny Rich, which is, why should the taxpayer fund lower outcomes? Because it's not about top outcomes, but the relative outcome the individual might have had with their education. That's what education's about, transformation. To ask a slightly different question of the panel, we've of course focused a discussion on the UK context, and we've got another session coming in a little while about international practice and learning from practice. But for you, you know, within the context of your practice and thinking, what are approaches internationally, or indeed among the devolved nations, that really sort of you know, is thought-provoking and inspires you that the UK system could consider? Vicky, can we throw to you? And I don't just mean in Western context too, by the way, across the world. There are lots of great higher education systems around the world, which we sometimes forget. But yeah, Vicky, would be great to throw to you.
Yeah, well, if I can pick up an example that's fairly close to home, and Quentin's already mentioned this, it's the use in the Scottish context of what they refer to as access thresholds. And this is a, you know, very well publicized, transparent statement that says, if you qualify for a contextual offer, if we recognize you as disadvantaged based on whatever the measures are that are being used, this is the entry the academic entry requirements that we'll ask you for. And I think that is a really good move, because it formalizes it, it publicizes it, and there's also been a way of presenting this in the Scottish context that I think has been very good, which is to really make clear that this is not about dumbing down, this is not about we don't think you're as good, but it's saying we know that if you're from this background and you've got these grades, you are really good, and we want to have you here. So I think the access thresholds model could be very usefully implemented in England. Great,
thank you. Mary, Quentin, any practice from you?
Yeah, I was just thinking, you know, my one problem with the whole kind of contextual admissions thing is that, you know, very bright students from, let's call them challenging backgrounds, I think often feel a bit patronized by that approach. You know, they're basically having to say, look, I come from a terrible family background. I've been to a rotten school. You know, I live in a terrible area. I've been on free school. You know, I'm putting my hands up to, you know, being kind of at the bottom of the pile. And I think that is problematic for for some students. I'd quite like to have a look at quotas. I think quotas are quite an interesting thing to throw into the mix, and I think it's done reasonably successful in some of the sort of Ivy League universities in the US. Certainly would sharpen minds a little bit if there were quotas. Perhaps controversial, sorry everybody.
No, we love controversial ideas. That's what the spirit of this panel's all about. Quintin, anything else from you to add?
Yeah, I'm going to give you a big radical one, which is absolutely impossible now to introduce in the UK. But if you look at some of our competitors where they do 4-year undergraduate degrees, it gives students an opportunity really to generate their innovative thinking, as well as subsequently then to look more specifically at particular disciplines and activities. And I think, and it would be really interesting to work out, and I don't know if this is possible, the economic advantage to a country of having a 4-year degree. You know, for instance, in Scotland, it's slightly different there because they start earlier. But if you look at the United States, the sort of more generalized entry degree activities, and then progressing into a more professionalized subject later on. I'd be really interested to know what the economic return on that sort of system was compared to our 3-year system.
Great.
And if I may just add to that, I think it's really, really important that we make the case for foundation years or year zeros, which I think have been a sort of hidden incentive and you know, have made great progress for widening participation. You know, the government is putting in place what they call a transition year for students between Key Stage 4 and 5 to progress onto T levels. And if we started thinking of foundation years as a kind of a transition year in the way that Quintin said, you know, a more general introduction before going on to the full program. I'm really worried actually that foundation years are going to get the chop in whatever, if we ever get any outcomes from the Auger review. And although I think when they first started growing very rapidly, I think it was a market response. It was a marketing response in the years of, you know, declining 18-year-old populations and the cap coming off it. And it was, you know, but since then, it's turned out to actually be a really good thing for widening participation. Vicky, does Durham do foundation years now?
Yeah, we've been doing them for a long time and with really good progression rates. Yeah, they're definitely an important part of the picture.
Yeah, and Oxford and Cambridge are doing them now, although in very, very small numbers. Mind you, they have small intakes anyway. But yeah, I think we should all be shouting much more about the potential for foundation years to support widening participation.
Terrific, thank you. And as I say, that is but a brief teaser into the next discussion, which will focus more substantially on international practice from the next panel. So, you know, there's another reason to stick around for that. As we approach the end of the discussion, the second time round, what I'd love to shift our conversation and thinking to is, with some of these measures in place, you know, how do we support students to succeed once they're in an institution, particularly in those early years? And we've seen from some of the panel, some of the audience here, some examples of good practice, the Leeds Plus program at the University of Leeds, Birmingham Scholars, and so on. What have you seen that's worked well? And importantly, you know, what do you think really matters in those early weeks and months of higher education for students to feel included, settled, and equipped to succeed? We might start with Quintin.
Yeah, I think I think one of the most important things is to catch students who are struggling early, and I think the way to do that, or one of the ways to do that, is to have a very good individual tutor system, an academic tutor system across your university. And I mean, nothing really can compete with that, the sort of engagement that an individual can get and the support they can get from an individual academic. And I think that's hugely important. I mean, there are also, of course, the opportunities to create, and we have them, other universities have them, specific catch-up programs, for instance, in mathematics, where the weaker students, or those students who are weaker in mathematics, can, of course, develop those skills and so on. So I think those sort of things are important. But for me, it's about and I'd love our university to be one of the advanced ones in terms of educational analytics, because it would be great to be able to pick up students just when you begin to see them faltering, because that's the time that you can really support them and get them back on track. If you leave them too long, they've gone.
I would say making it easier to switch course or even university at any time during the first year. I just hear about so many people who, who've maybe made decisions about where to apply and what to apply for a full year before they start at university. I'm talking mainly about school leavers here. And of course, that final year at school or college, there's this enormous amount of maturing that goes on for young people. And some of them find when they get there that suddenly they notice a course that that didn't even kind of cross their mind when they were applying, and they think, oh, I'd like to do that. But my experience is that it's incredibly difficult to switch, even within a university, let alone between universities. And I think just giving a bit more support for for sort of cooling off and changing your mind would be a real benefit.
Thank you, Mary. And Vicky.
I guess I'd underscore what Quintin said about that one-to-one personal relationship between students and their teachers. I think that's really important, and it's very difficult to do that at the moment with, even in the most well-resourced universities, quite high ratios of students to staff. So I'd like to see more resource devoted to staff time to actually proactively reach out to students, build those relationships in informal and informal ways, because part of the problem is that students come to university, find it utterly bewildering, don't think that they're able to ask for help and support and advice and guidance, and will struggle on as best they can, and some will just decide it's too difficult to do that. So I think the closer the relationship we can develop with our incoming students, the better. But as I say, that really requires quite a lot of resource to make that possible.
Thank you, Vicky. And just to add to this discussion from a slightly different perspective, of course, we've spoken a lot here about the academic relationship and the closeness of teachers, but with some of the work that we've been doing with universities, when we think about issues of equality and diversity, around anti-racism, around codes of conduct, other sort of issues that impact the student experience, one of the most interesting insights that I've really come to realize in recent times is how important those first few weeks are for students, particularly from diverse backgrounds, to know what kind of community they're being welcomed into and that are a part of. And that is really important in making them feel valued and supported to succeed. And indeed, some of the comments here around the identification of, or the self-identification of students, whether it be as disadvantaged or different or other, how do we actually overcome those attitudes to ensure that all students feel like they really fully belong in a higher education institution? So really, really valuable reflections there from colleagues. And it is time to now wrap up the discussion. So I would love to throw to the panel again. We spoke about one thing that that you'd like to change earlier, or one intervention that could make a real difference. But for you, where do you think the future of fair admissions is heading more broadly? And are there any other final kind of reflections and hopes that you would like to leave our audience with today? And in doing, can I just thank all of the audience members for all of your valuable and really thoughtful questions and provocations, and we'll try and make sure that we pick up those in the chat offline. But to the panel once more, your hopes and aspirations for fair admissions and any final reflections. And we'll start with Mary.
Yeah, thanks, Minto. I think I'm going to slightly dodge this because, of course, we've got a new director of access and participation at the OFS. Obviously, that's for England only, but England is a very large system. And I think especially in the wake of the consultations that came out last week about thresholds and so on, and all our worries about what that might mean for contextual admissions and widening access and so on, I think it'll be very interesting to see what the new director, John Blake, has to say about this, because I think the sector is probably not quite sure where this is all going at the moment. And whilst we've all got our own particular ideas about widening access, we also have to know about the regulatory and oversight context within which we're doing that work. And then, refocus our efforts if necessary, to make sure that we're helping as many people as possible.
Thank you. Vicky.
Well, if I can perhaps mention one fear that I have for the future, it's around the quality agenda. And I'm a little concerned that might prove to be a stick to beat lower tariff universities with very unfairly. It seems that the higher tariff universities are probably not going to be much at risk from the emphasis on graduate labour market destinations. And I think it's very unfair actually to place responsibility so heavily on universities for graduate destinations. It's very different to saying universities ought to close the attainment gap, ensure low dropout rates. These are things that are within universities' control, but labour market destinations of graduates, it's much more to do with the wider economic structure and the economic cycle, isn't it? So, and as we've said before, the prestige differences between institutions that are magnified by the way league tables are constructed makes it very difficult for lower tariff universities to get those same outcomes for their students. So I think it would be a real shame if we fixated on quality as measured by graduate labour market returns and use that to incorrectly say that lower tariff universities weren't doing a good job by their students, because we know from the social mobility measures and the teaching quality measures that new universities, lower tariff universities, are actually doing a sterling job by their students.
Thanks, Vicky. And of course, while it is uncomfortable to acknowledge fees, it's really important to do so. These issues are, of course, nested in regulatory pressures as well as the wider structural and social inequalities that we continue to grapple with as a community. So thank you for acknowledging that. And the final word to you, Quintin, before I just very briefly wrap up.
Well, I'd like to see a philosophical change in both our politicians and our society, and I think we've moved to a position where people feel there's a set capacity that universities have, and that there's a set number of or percentage of the population that should go to university and no one else should. I think anyone who could benefit from university should be encouraged to go to university. Accepting your point earlier, Minto, that of course there are other opportunities for people to develop and gain education in different ways, but having some kind of a set maximum seems absolutely barking to me. And I do appreciate that this is all wrapped up with the financing of universities and everything else, but fundamentally, my belief is that the more people we can get into university, the better our economy will be, the better our society will be, and the better our civilization will be. So I just think we should try as best we can to change the philosophy of those people who are looking at universities in a sort of very much more of a capacity sense, and saying, when we went to university, only 14% of the population went. How come 48% currently go? That can't be right. Well, of course it's right. It's brilliant. It's fantastic. But let's make it 60%. Why not?
And to be clear, I absolutely share that ambition too, and I think so does the rest of the panel. There is no limit when it comes to education, and to use the kind of comments that were made earlier. If the goal is about transformation, if the goal is about a more enlightened, thoughtful, productive community, then absolutely, higher education is critical to that. And quality, while we've really come to put certain narrow measures on it, if quality is about transformation, if quality is about people having expanded freedoms and opportunities, then that is a worthwhile pursuit for individuals to be aspiring to, and indeed that should be the framer of higher education as a sector and as a system. Thank you again to our panelists, to Quintin McKellar, to Vicky Bolivar, to Mary Kernock-Cook. Apologies for the slight technical difficulty on my part, but I have found the conversation also extremely illuminating. These are unresolved live 5 very important matters to keep reflecting on. So thank you for your valued input and to the richness of the audience discussion and commentary. So now we will go into a brief break of about 13 minutes. I think we're slightly ahead of schedule by 1 minute. And next we will come back to a panel that will be around international practice. What else is happening all over the world, and what perhaps we can learn from these practices